Hello and welcome. We are so glad you could join us for the 100th anniversary of one of history's greatest milestones, the certification of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. In this webinar, we have entitled Marching from Suffrage Toward Equality. We plan to explore how a 72-year battle to acknowledge a woman's right to vote was just the beginning of women's rights movements in America. I'm honored to be here as moderator. I've been a volunteer with this organization for several years, and I can't think of a more worthy undertaking. I'm a network news anchor and correspondent formerly with the AP and NPR, and most recently with Westwood One News. We are delighted to have with us 4 incredible women, including the first woman to break the corporate glass ceiling to lead a Fortune 50 company, Carly Fiorina. Ms. Fiorina was a trailblazing CEO of Hewlett-Packard during the tech revolution. In 2016, she became one of a very few women in history to gain recognition on the national stage as a contender for a major party's presidential nomination. And today she is an acclaimed author and founder of Carly Fiorina Enterprises, where she advocates for effective leadership. Elisabeth Griffith. Hi, Carly.
Hi.
Elisabeth Griffith is an historian and educator who is a revered expert on women's history, politics, leadership, and education. Her biography of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, in her own right, was named one of the best books of the century by the editors of the New York Times Book Review, and it inspired Ken Burns' PBS documentary, Not for Ourselves Alone. She is currently writing a social and political history of American women between 1920 and 2020. Hi, Betsy. Charnel Herring was elected to the General Assembly in a 2009 special election, the first African-American woman from Northern Virginia ever elected to Virginia's legislature. She serves as the chair of the Courts of Justice Committee and on the Governor's Crime Commission. In 2019, she was chosen by her peers to serve as majority leader of the House of Delegates, the first woman and the first African-American to hold that title. We are grateful for her time during a special legislative session, and we recognize that she may have to leave us just a little early tonight. Madam Leader, we are having difficulty reaching her technologically, but we hope that will clear up shortly. Victoria Lipnic serves as a commissioner of the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, confirmed in 2010 and in 2015 by the U.S. Senate for 2 consecutive 5-year terms. During her time at the EEOC, her signature issues have included those which especially impact women in their working lives: equal pay, age discrimination, and harassment in the workplace. She co-chaired the EEOC's Select Task Force on the Study of Harassment in the Workplace, which issued a seminal report in June of 2016, 16 months before the major press reporting on sexual harassment that launched the Me Too movement. Victoria Lipnic.
Good to be with you.
We are so grateful to have all of you with us today. To those of you who are participating as viewers, you can submit questions to any of our participants through the chat feature on the right side of your screen. We will do our best to get to as many of them as possible. So let us begin before the beginning. 100 years ago, about 2 out of every 10 women were working outside the home, and half of them were working in the industrial sector, in textile and garment production, for example. Most Black women were working as domestic servants. It was a time not only of minimal privilege for women, but of racial oppression and violence and xenophobia. Ms. Griffith, what changed in 1920 to make the 19th Amendment a reality?
1920 was a landmark year. It was a presidential election like this year. Republican Warren Harding won in a landslide. By that point, both political parties realized that women were going to be players. Republicans and Democrats had opposed women's suffrage almost to the bitter end until they decided that these women might be constituents. They might need them. So they were wary of women voters. We don't know how many women voted in 1920 because there were no exit polls. People assumed women voted for Harding over the Democratic ticket because he was so handsome. He also endorsed a very strong women's platform that had been proposed by the League of Women Voters. But his campaign pledge was a return to normalcy, and people were eager for calmer times because they'd been through the First World War, called the Great War. They didn't know there was going to be a second one. They'd been through a pandemic, race riots, Red Scares, and the women's movement, the suffrage movement, which had made everybody anxious because women were marching in the street and picketing. In 1920, they didn't know it was going to be the 20s. They had passed prohibition, but they didn't expect speakeasies and jazz and flappers and Cole Porter's anything goes. If you lived in an urban area, you were surrounded by sin and sex and gin. But half the country was in rural areas where there was more evangelicalism and greater racial disparity. The racial issues were intense. There was widespread racial violence, the Tulsa Massacre. The Klan had grown exponentially. There was a lot of lynching. But another factor that would be important in the women's movement was the Black migration. Began in about 1915. Isabel Wilkerson has talked about this. Blacks moved out of the South into northern and western cities, where they still found segregation, but they could found newspapers and have political organizations and jobs and housing that were better than what they had left behind. So that's a background for the passage of the 19th Amendment. So the 19th Amendment, the wording is, you can't discriminate on account of sex in voting, that sex is not an issue to bar women from voting. In the United States, no language about territories. So women living in territories did not vote, Puerto Rico not till 1935. No language about women living on Indian reservations. Native American women did not vote until beginning in 1924, but really not until 1965, because states like Minnesota and Maine and New Mexico continued to discriminate. No voting for Asian immigrants until 1943 because we were allied with the Chinese in the war. And so from 1943 into the 50s, we began to allow Asian immigrants to vote. Legally, Black women could vote under the 19th Amendment, but how you voted was set by state laws. So women living in northern cities, Black women living in northern cities, very likely voted. Ida B. Wells Barnett voted in Chicago. We know she led an electoral district where she had registered people and voted a lot. Mary McLeod Bethune faced down the Klan in Florida and voted. Mary Church Terrell, enormous leader of the African American women's movement, did not vote because she lived in the District of Columbia, which had the same status of a territory, no voting in the district. But Black women resident in the South fell under the same Jim Crow state laws that Black men did. So there were poll taxes, $10 a vote. That's a huge amount of money in that era. Literacy tests randomly assigned, grandfather clauses. If your grandfather had been enslaved, you were not allowed to vote. And the most discriminatory of all was among many, was a white primary law. If you couldn't vote in a primary in a Southern one-party state, then you were really disenfranchised entirely, and that didn't change until 1944. So African-American men and women in the South were disenfranchised, and white suffragists said, not our problem. That's a race problem, that's not a sex problem. Really only Black women understood that intersectionality. So 1920, there's this potential of what will women do? Men don't know, and so they're very wary. A lot of legislation passes in the first 4 years, 1921 to the next presidential election. They pass, they're focused on maternal and infant health. They're focused on child labor. They try to establish women's prisons. They want to add physical education to girls' high school curriculum. They're worried about working conditions. That's the political agenda. You have more globally oriented women wanting to work for peace. You have Alice Paul and her faction in the National Women's Party proposing an equal rights amendment, which offended all of her feminist allies because it would have eliminated all of the protections that they tried to put in place for factory women. And you have Margaret Sanger preaching birth control, which alarmed absolutely everybody. So there are factions from the very beginning. African-American women were really less interested in most of those issues, although they benefited clearly from the maternal and infant health issues and some of the factory conditions. But Black women had as their priority the personal safety of their communities. They wanted enforcement of the 14th Amendment. They wanted anti-lynching laws, and they wanted safety for themselves and their children. So from the very beginning, there were diverging agendas and a different history that came to this new decade of the 1920s.
Ms. Lipnic, today women are still underrepresented in major professions, including the sciences, the tech sectors. There is a huge gender pay gap. We have challenges ranging from sexual harassment to ageism. So what still needs to happen as we go forward to make sure that some of the changes that began with the 19th Amendment continue today?
Right. Well, and first of all, I want to thank the Turning Point Memorial Foundation for inviting me to be a part of this. Well, let me just first add to what Betsy was saying earlier. So from 1920, it's another 45 years until you get the Voting Rights Act. It's 44 years until you get Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And the Civil Rights Act in 1964 includes language that you cannot discriminate against people in the terms and conditions of their employment based on race, national origin, color, religion, and sex. And many people know, and Betsy probably knows this history better than anyone, but there's a fairly famous story about how sex got added into Title VII of the Civil Rights Act at the last minute by a Virginia congressman. There's been a long time story that he added sex in because he was trying to bring down the entire Civil Rights Act. That's probably largely been debunked at this point. He was actually a supporter of women's rights. Nevertheless, it was at the last minute that sex was added in, and I think it was about 14 members of the House of Representatives at that time were women. There were only 2 women in the United States Senate at that time, and Margaret Chase Smith was one of them, a Republican member from Maine, and she absolutely saved sex being included as an amendment to Title VII. And the fact that it was really so that, 44-year period between when the 19th Amendment passes and then when the Civil Rights Act passes, but adding sex in really transforms women's experiences in the workplace and just opens up incredible opportunity for women in the workplace. When the EEOC first opened its doors in 1965, and remember, much of the Civil Rights Act, the major impetus was about race. But when the EEOC opened its doors in 1965, the agency was overwhelmed when 1/3 of the complaints of discrimination that got filed with the agency were from women based on sex. And a number of the really seminal cases that first start being handled by the commission have to do with women flight attendants and all kinds of rules that had their work conditions very difficult for them to keep their jobs. So if they gained weight, they would get fired. If they were pregnant, they got fired. But until we get to 1964 and 65, you don't really start to have all these opportunities in the workplace for women. So, here we are now, 55 years later from the EEOC opening its doors. And I can tell you that sex discrimination in the workplace and sexual harassment in the workplace and lack of equal pay occupies a lot of time of the EEOC. And of course, as a government agency, we're only one slice of what's going on in so many workplaces around the country. So there's still a lot of work to be done as both the case law develops and as there's so much attention on opportunities for women in the workplace. And as Betsy said, particularly in terms of a lot of what we see, the intersection of race and sex. You just a few years ago had a major case in front of the Supreme Court that had to do with pregnancy discrimination and whether or not pregnant women could get accommodations in the workplace if they needed light duty, for example, while they were pregnant, in the same manner that someone who is injured on the job. So, so many issues continue to so many things you would think, gee, wasn't that resolved a long time ago? In fact, there are many aspects of related to women and working where there's still a lot to do in terms of both opportunity and conditions in the workplace for women.
Between 1920 and the 1963 Equal Pay Act, the 1964 Title VII, and the 1965 Voting Rights Act, those were the only times that the word sex had been used in a national piece of legislation or a constitutional amendment. So we weren't being paid a lot of attention to.
Right.
Ms. Fiorina, I referred to you as a trailblazer. You are, in fact, a trailblazer for women. What made the difference for you? Why were you able to, or were able to build on your capabilities and your skills and break through that corporate glass ceiling?
Well, first, thank you so much for having me, and it's a delight to be with my other distinguished panelists. And I want to say, in response to your question, that first, we know, as the two previous speakers have indicated, that there is still a great deal of systemic work to be done. I mean, it started obviously with gaining the right to vote, and then gaining basic legal protections, and then gaining the right not to be discriminated against. And there is still so much of that systemic legal work to be done, whether it has to do with childcare or wages or lack of discrimination. I think one of the things that we know about women in the boardroom, for example, or women in top corporate jobs is so often a crisis creates the opportunity for people to think differently. I was the first woman to lead a Fortune 50 company. There are a few more now than there were then, but even today in 2020, there are more men named James in the Fortune 500 than there are women CEOs. I was asked to lead Hewlett-Packard in a time of crisis and transformation for that company. And that is so often the case. I think we know that crisis creates also opportunity for people to take a risk that they might not have been willing to take before. And I use that term risk because in addition to all the systemic issues we have been talking about, many of which still exist, there is also this human dynamic at play that we need to remember. And here's what that human dynamic is. People are most comfortable with people like themselves. People are most comfortable with people like themselves. It is human nature. And so what that means is that people tend to surround themselves with people just like them. What that means is that who's ever at the table tends to stay at the table and tends to bring more people like them to the table. And when you look at what goes on in a corporate boardroom or in the C-suite, what you'll hear people say a lot is, well, I don't know them, or I'm uncomfortable with them, What a crisis does is create an opportunity where suddenly somebody says, you know what, maybe I need to take a risk on someone different. See, that's the thing. When we're most comfortable with people like ourselves, someone different, a woman, for example, or a person of color, or God forbid, a woman of color, that different person seems riskier than someone who's just like me, a guy I know, a guy who can finish my sentences. And so I think often crisis creates real opportunity for people to think differently. I also believe, however, that if we are going to continue to make the progress that is necessary in this country for women, for people of color, whether it's progress in justice, whether it's progress in employment, whether it's progress in pay, whether it's progress in participation, in addition to all the systemic issues that we talk about, we also need to wrestle with human nature and remember that people are most comfortable with people like themselves. And so we need to help people get better at interacting with people that are different than themselves. And this is why when I've developed leaders all my life, I've built diverse teams. It's why when we develop leaders today, I always start with humility and empathy. Because if you don't have humility, then you actually assume you know it all. And you aren't open to hearing something different from someone different. And if you lack empathy, you can't value someone else's experience because it's different from yours. Instead, you judge that person. And perhaps, too often, human beings judge someone's different experience harshly because they cannot understand it. So we got to deal with human nature. And there are systemic things we can do in the C-suite, in the boardroom. We can do gender-blind resumes. We can do gender-blind hiring. We can talk through in candid, open ways. Why does this person feel riskier to you? Because here's the truth. So often, if we just stick to what we know, if we just stick to who we know, if we just stick with the same old status quo, that turns out to be the riskiest choice of all. Because what we really need is someone who knows something we don't know, with an experience that we don't have, to show us a different way.
Ms. Lipnic, how does federal law especially balance or play a role of a balance, or maybe it's the fulcrum in there somewhere, to push back against, if in fact the human nature aspect of this, and I'm not disputing it, is a reality? What role does the law play in helping to level the field?
Well, it plays a pretty significant role. I'm really, as Carly was talking there, I was really struck by the idea of human nature, because I can tell you, certainly in the cases that I see at the EEOC, so you have sort of what are known as two types of discrimination. One is called disparate treatment. Someone treats me differently because I'm a woman, and then disparate impact, which has more to do with, on a broader scale, policies. But so much about the treatment cases, whether it's based on sex or race or religion, so much of it is about human nature and how people individually will treat someone else in their workplace. So in terms of work, the federal law, I mean, there are any number of protections in addition to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that prohibits discrimination. Just a few months ago in June, there was sort of more movement from the United States Supreme Court in terms of discrimination that included in a landmark decision by the Supreme Court that the language that you cannot be discriminated against because of sex actually covers sexual orientation and gender identity. So, the law sets the standard, and certainly federal law, it's also always expanding. So, it wasn't until the early 1990s we had the Family and Medical Leave Act, which for the first time recognizes that not just women, but any caregiver, that this is a major aspect of their working lives, and they should not have to lose their job when they have a child or have caregiving needs. So the Equal Pay Act, which is a year before the Civil Rights Act of 1964, in 1963, sets the standard for equal pay for equal work. So, the law sets the standard, but how it then plays out in everyday workplaces, and not just workplaces, but that's my area in particular, depends so much on exactly what Carly was saying about so much, how do people interact with each other, engage with each other, understand each other, and work with each other in a productive manner in their workplaces every day.
I'd like to pick up on two themes, if I may. One is, I'm sure Carly knows from her experience that there's research now that shows that the more diverse governing groups are, the more productive and successful they are. And I think there are only 26 corporations that have half women and half men. It's still a very small number. And among the CEOs, as you were, is it not that there are 27 now, 3 women of color, no blacks, of women at that leadership level? But I don't want to say human nature, because human nature makes it sound like it's not changeable. I prefer to say sex role socialization, how we learn what appropriate behavior is for us by sex. And I think it's been instilled in American women since the colonial era that we were supposed to behave in a certain way in charge of certain areas, the home, virtue, education, children. And as women became reformers and suffragists and activists, they expanded that definition of their sphere to become the community, that women should be the good housekeepers of government. And I think sexual socialization changes. It's like that Rodgers and Hammerstein lyric, you have to be carefully taught. I think our young people today are learning lots of different lessons that some of us did not learn when we were growing up in my era, about what boys and girls are capable of, what their opportunities are. I think we're going to see lots of changes, but they're still being held back. The areas of the sciences have the least progress for women, and more women leave the sciences on account of sex harassment and discrimination. So we need to keep pressing ways for young people to envision themselves in different roles and then open those opportunities. You made reference to the pay gap. There's so much data about that now been collected. But even if you take into account the number of hours women work in a year, the amount of time they take off for childcare, what they majored in, what their occupations are, women are still tending to major in what are called soft fields, service fields, nursing, education, healthcare. Men major in engineering and construction and business. So their career paths change quite dramatically. Women are accommodating for wanting to take care of children as their lives progress. So even if you take into account all of those things and you say, well, women are maybe only 10 cents a difference of that 10 cents is sex discrimination. And it's very hard to get to the root of it and to find ways to eliminate it. At some point, I'd like to circle back to African Americans.
Yeah. I actually think we're all agreeing. When I use the term human nature, I don't at all think it's not changeable. In fact, history says change does happen. Actually, huge changes happen. It is to say, and I think honestly we all agree, corporate America today spends $8 billion a year on diversity and inclusion training. And it's pretty clear that training isn't working because, as you point out, corporate America remains still not a terribly diverse place with a lot of systemic discrimination and systemic inequality, as our society remains that way. And yet, we do know that people can change. My only point in bringing up human nature is to say that in the end, I loved how Victoria put this, in the end, law sets the standard. Systemic changes set the standard and the expectations. Then we have to actually put in place the processes, the training, the development of human beings so that we can live up to those standards. And yes, just to punctuate a point, the data is unmistakable. The more diverse a team you have, which must include people of color, the more diverse team you have, the better the results of that team are. And there's a reason for that. And this also gets back to human nature. And that is that each of us do not learn unless we are challenged by someone different or something new. That's just a fact. We don't learn unless we're challenged. And so if you get a diverse team of people together who can actually work together with humility and empathy and respect for what's different about them, they achieve better results every time. And yet we know we remain in so many ways, as we've been saying, a racist society as well as a sexist society.
Vicki, I want to pursue something with you that you raised. I think that there are institutional issues that women confront, and not having adequate, affordable, universal childcare, not having paid family leave, are things that keep women from advancing in the workforce, from being able to balance their lives. I'm hoping that the pandemic has taught a lot of men about what women do at home and might lead to, it's either going to destroy the gains that women have made, or it will help lead to some new equality on the home front. But we can't expect women to be competing equally when they are not supported with structures that allow them to do that.
Right. And actually, and I would add to that, and I say this as someone who at one point in my life, prior to being at the EEOC, was Assistant Secretary of Labor. So one of the laws I was in charge of was the Family and Medical Leave Act. And what was so clear to me in administering that law, and this is in the 2000s, is not just that people needed the time to be able to tend to their caregiving, but they needed health insurance and their health care. And they were so wanted to and needed to hang on to their jobs because, of course, you know, whether it was for their child or elder care or their own personal circumstances, they needed health care. So those you know, those kinds of supports and whether income supports or insurance are critical for women, but not just women, right, to be able to not only have a successful career and work, but to be able to manage their personal lives as well in the ways that they want to. You know, I one thing I would say is, you know, there's always, just like back to where we started, right? Just like women getting the right to vote, something has to start it, right? So until you had, right, the first step, which was the Family and Medical Leave Act in 1990, or 1991, that you know, finally provides this workplace protection. Well, that's all unpaid leave. But you have to have this first step before workplaces and cultures can adapt, and then you can you know, see how all of that works and then move on to the next step. And it certainly does seem to me that we are at a real, not just because of the coronavirus situation, but you know, the racial reckoning, and we are at a really critical point where there's lots of discussion and opportunity, and there's tremendous generational change right now. That, you know, people have different expectations about what they want about their working lives and their family lives, and both women and men. There's probably more convergence today, I think, between the expectations of women and men about what they want than probably any other time prior, certainly all the way back to 1920. So you know, there's opportunity, but you know, there always have to be those first steps, those first laws, to get us there. And but I do think we're at this, critical inflection point right now.
If only there were convergence in the number of hours that men spend in housework and the number of wages that men and women get. Okay, so here's a political question. Women, when they thought the vote was going to solve a lot of problems. They would be voting, people would be responsive, they would run for office, they would make progress and make change. So women did not initially vote in large numbers because there, again, sort of sex role socialization. It was so surprising that women would vote that they felt timid about doing it. There was a poll done in Chicago in 1923 asking women why they had not voted, and their husbands didn't approve, or they did not approve of voting at that time. Women voted in large numbers in 1928 because they thought Hoover was a safer bet than Al Smith, who represented Catholicism and drinking. They voted in large numbers for Ike. They voted in large numbers against Goldwater for Lyndon Johnson in 1964. And then beginning in 1980 is when you begin to see the gender gap. And the gender gap plays two ways. It's a gender gap between male and female support for one candidate or another. And it's also a gender gap between the parties. Which parties do women support in larger numbers than others? One of the reasons African-American women are playing such a significant role in our politics at the moment is because they have been such loyal supporters of the Democratic Party for several generations now. But women have not made progress in electoral politics. I think the highest we are is maybe 32% at the state legislative level, 31% of lieutenant governors. We're less than a quarter of the Congress. And the higher in authority that women get, as women run, if you've been to state legislature, I wish Charnel were here, and ran for governor, her support falls off. Women may have been terrific senators, they run for president, their support falls off. Because the image, as Carly described for us, of leadership is white, male, and straight. And the farther you fall off of that, people of color, women, homosexual, gay, LGBTQ, the higher the challenges are.
Will there be a generational change in that? And
yes, and you see it in the people who are running. Younger people are getting elected, a more diverse crowd, but we certainly haven't broken into large numbers in the Senate or the state houses or the presidential races, until the present nominees.
Carly?
Well, I'll tell you a couple of funny stories. They're funny. They also make you scream. But when I became a CEO of Hewlett-Packard, I was interviewed on the very first day by the editor of a very prominent business magazine at the time. And the editor's very first question, was who had designed my suit. Now, you might think that was a long time ago. When I was running for president after a particularly, I thought, boffo debate performance, the very first question that my campaign manager got was, who designed my shoes? And I remember being on a national television program, and a woman reporter, actually a young woman reporter, asked me whether I thought a woman's hormones prevented her from serving in the Oval Office. My answer at the time was, gee, I can't think of a single instance in which a man's judgment might have been clouded by his hormones. My point in telling you those stories, they make us scream, they make us our hair curl and all the rest, but is to just illustrate what we know is true. That when you're different, it's different. When you're different, the expectations are different. The scrutiny is different. The criticism is different. And so if you're different in any way, you're LGBTQ, you're a person of color, you're a woman, if you're different in any way, if you're a person with whom we don't have a lot of practice seeing you in that particular role, then everything's different for you in terms of scrutiny, expectations, criticism, questions. I don't know how to legislate against that. But what I do know is the only way to get through that is to have more practice at it, which means that more people who are not on that white male straight spectrum have to stand up and lead, have to run, have to try, have to go for the corner office. The more practice we get, particularly as the standards we set get more and more equitable, the more practice we get, the better we're going to do. But there's no denying the fact that it's still different when you're different. And it's also different even with young people.
So we have a question, which is, why is the U.S., and I'm going to phrase this in a different way, is the U.S. different from other countries in that way? Is the U.S., or the barriers in the U.S. more rigid?
Well, two statistics. In terms of women in office, the United States is 78th, someplace, down near Kazakhstan, in levels of representation. But the countries that are above us are frequently parliamentary systems, or they're systems that have mandated the number of women representatives. 1/3 or 1/2 in many Middle Eastern countries have legislatures that are, quote, more representative. In terms of women in leadership roles, there are only 10 or 12. So Nancy Pelosi, as a leader of a legislature, is in a rare group because the system is different. I think discrimination is everywhere. I don't think any particular culture does it better than we do, because all of these attitudes have been so deeply rooted in religion and culture, tradition for generations, and law. It's taken a long time to come over all of those things. When there were 6 women, just one more footnote, when there were 6 women running in the primary, in the Democratic primary, some journalist wrote she was so optimistic she thought people would actually be talking about policy and not pantsuits. But we still get the fashion commentary. I'm very pleased that this group that called themselves We Have Your Back have declared that they're going to call out sexist and racist commentary on any woman candidate in either party during this season, because they've learned in several of the past campaigns how Carly was treated, how other candidates have been treated, that somebody needs to call the press as well as the opponents on the language that they are using.
And again, I am so sorry that Charnel Herring is not able to be with us because of whatever the internet struggles were. But I'm wondering what role the freedom that we have, the voting freedoms that we have, play in possibly reinforcing some of those barriers. Because many of the countries that might rank higher than us and who have certain mandates for what the proportions are in legislative functions and whatever, might not have as open a system of ballots and of voting for the adult population. Is that a factor?
I think this brings us back to where we began. Who got suffrage, who got to use suffrage, what the state laws discriminating were. I think I love the parallelism that it's the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment and the 55th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act, because I think makes much more sense to pair them together, because that's how we got inclusive voting. But we still have so many barriers to voting. The length of time the polls are open, how many polling places there are, the requirement for ID. There's a upper Midwestern state that has put in a voting ID that you have to have a street address, like a house number in a street. People living on Native American reservations do not have streets with house numbers. So that takes people out. What kind of ID is acceptable at the voting booth? We still have too many impediments to voting rights. I'm hoping, that attention is paid to that, because so many people, women taking generations of fighting and losing to get suffrage, of going to jail and picketing and parading and fighting so hard for the cause, and in coalition. The suffrage coalition wasn't, I won't say integrated, was a multiracial coalition up to 1920, and then it splits up again. But then Black women have to fight all over again the backbone of the civil rights movement, the deaths, the beating, the jailings, that you knew to take toilet paper and a toothbrush in your purse every time you left home because you weren't sure where you were going to spend the night. This country has bled for voting rights. We still don't turn out in large enough numbers, and everybody should be thinking what a blessing that is, what a right that is, and be using it as we celebrate these anniversaries of suffrage and the Voting Rights Act.
What kind of a role has feminism played in this arc that we've been talking about, and the way that the title of feminist has been either adopted or rejected over the past decades?
I think that's really an important question, because I think the term should not be political, but I think in some ways it has become political. So I define a feminist as a woman who determines her own life, if she has the opportunity to do so, and lives the life she chooses. I think over time, when I say the word feminist got politicized, what I mean by that is somehow we got to this place, in this country at least, where we think women all think alike. And I actually think that diminishes the power of women. So I have been called, I was called as a presidential candidate, I was called offensive to women, because I happen to believe that life begins at conception and that there should be some limits on abortion. And many Democrat women's groups do not believe that. But on the other hand, we did not fight for the right to vote so that we would all march in lockstep and agree on every issue. We don't expect men to all agree. We don't expect people of color to all agree. Why would we expect women to all agree? And so I think feminism shouldn't be a political point. It shouldn't be a political term. It should mean that if you are a woman, you have the same opportunity as any man to live the life you choose. Although we recognize that not every person, man or woman, has the opportunity to live the life they choose. It shouldn't be, you're not really a feminist unless you believe this litany of political beliefs. So I also applaud this We've Got Your Back movement that says, you know what, we're going to stand up for any woman. We may not agree with her on everything, but what we applaud always is her right to determine for herself her point of view and how she's going to live her life and how she chooses to use her talents.
My definition is broader than Carly's. It's the classic Webster's Dictionary definition that feminism is the belief that men and women have equal political, social, and economic rights. So
exactly, that's the right definition.
Male feminist to female feminist, but it has been so politicized over time. At the time in 1920, there were suffragists and social justice feminists, and they had different perspectives. The Equal Rights Amendment people were really wanting rights for white middle-class women more than for lower-class women. The social justice women were more involved in factory workers. But during the wave of the women's movement that took over the 1970s, lots of new adjectives were added to feminism, including, interestingly, choice feminism. Choice feminism is sort of this sense that you get to define your own independence and every woman ought to get to do that. But then choice feminism got linked to choice on reproductive rights, and so that split people off. You have Republican feminists, you have Black feminists. Black feminists would say that a white feminist wants her own better job, wants to be in the C-suite, wants an equal wage. A Black feminist would say she wants to end poverty and deal with racial violence and the equivalent of community building and issues of poverty and communities that are broader. That they would say that their feminism extends over a broader range than some other people. Sarah Palin said that she was a frontier feminism or a grizzly mom feminist. You have all kinds of feminists. And I wish people could take it down to a definition that we're just fighting for political, social, and economic rights. But because of all the tensions over reproductive rights, when that got added into the mix, it created this huge division, a partisan division, about which side you're going to fall on, and feminism suffered in the middle. So maybe we could just be women who were for women's rights and to make sure that we have equal opportunities and opportunities that allow women to achieve. And pro-choice feminists would say that a right to abortion and reproductive rights is an element in women's achieving. That's one of Justice Ginsburg's argument in these birth control cases.
And Ms. Fiorina, you were saying something. I'm sorry. I think you got
No, I was just agreeing with her last statement, which is I think that women, we diminish our own power when we get caught up in the wrong argument. I very much like the broadest definition of feminism. And when we sort of divide ourselves over political issues, of course, we're going to have different political points of view. That is our right as women, just as it is men's right. But I think when we can see the bigger picture, women actually have greater power. And politically speaking, one of the terms that just drives me crazy is when people will talk about women's issues, which I find such a diminishing phrase, because my goodness, we're more than half the nation. Every issue is a woman's issue. Literally every issue is a woman's issue, and women have an important contribution and point of view about every single issue. So what are women's issues?
Exactly.
We are the majority of the nation.
We are coming perilously close to the end of our program. So I wanted to, it's very important. And I think all of this falls under the umbrella of recognizing our history, recognizing the challenges that lie ahead. I'd like for us to discuss the importance of the Turning Point Suffragist Memorial. And Ms. Griffith, if you could lead off, I think one of the really significant questions that we always hear is why Occoquan?
Well, why Occoquan? Because it was one of the two prisons to which the suffragists, the picketing suffragists, the members of the National Women's Party were sent after January 1917, when they started picketing the White House. And by that summer, after the First World War had been declared, their ardor was met with a patriotic response that people did not want women criticizing the President of the United States for not making America safe for democracy and not giving women the vote when our troops were fighting for that abroad. So women got arrested for obstructing traffic on the sidewalk, and they did not back down. It was $25 fine or 3 days in jail, and they kept sending out volunteers. So then it was a $50 fine and 2 weeks in jail, and pretty soon it was 7 weeks in jail or 7 months in jail. And that's when women would start to go on the hunger strikes. Occoquan on November 14th, 1917, 30 women were jailed and they were beaten and mistreated, and that led eventually to the release of all the women and their sentences being relieved. So marking places where women have fought for the right to vote, in the same way that we think about the Edmund Pettus Bridge or places where Fannie Lou Hamer was beaten up and thrown into jail, we need to be marking women's history in public spaces. But we also need to be very conscious about our historical thinking. For years, women were written out of history books that had been written by white men, as were everybody else. You had to be a president or a general or a robber baron to be covered. You weren't getting the factory workers or the voters or the enslaved people being covered in those reports. And then when white women start writing history, they are equally arrogant about not being as inclusive as they might. Elisabeth Cady Stanton, subject of an excellent biography by me, wrote a 6-volume history of women's suffrage. She left out Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, who was an African American who had the nerve to say to Stanton in the fight over the Civil War amendments, "We need white women to stop oppressing us and to treat us like equals in this fight for suffrage." So Stanton writes her out of the minutes of the meeting and out of the history. She also wrote out her rival, Lucy Stone. So there's a lot of writing out of people, and we need to think about whom we are including. We clearly know that monuments have been used for purposes good and ill, the sort of saving of the Confederate myths in those statues. But the fact that the state of Arkansas is replacing some 19th century men with Daisy Bates, who was the courageous head of the NAACP, who took care of the Little Rock Nine every day for the year that they integrated that high school, is now going to join Statuary Hall, or that Mary McLeod Bethune is being sent there by Florida. People need to see themselves in this history. And I think the emotional ties of the turning point at Occoquan and the heroism of those women, we attract people to that story, to the whole regional history of suffrage in Washington, is a way of storytelling, and storytelling done in a scholarly way, a factually accurate way, does, what does one say, the mystic bonds of memory. We need to create those stories because they change the myths and change the sexual socialization so that people see themselves differently.
Ms. Lipnic, well, what kind of a role does the effective storytelling of women's history and the acknowledgement of history play in the way that our legal system plays out today, in the way that women are addressed in their opportunities and in employment?
Well, first of all, let me say that I am a great lover of history, and history was one of my majors in college, and I'm someone who studies history, but I also really believe in my work in public policy and in the law that you really have to understand history to understand, well, why do we have this law, and how did this come about, and what was the intent of it, and where do we want to go from here? And but certainly, with the Turning Point Memorial, I think it's just incredibly important that and this anniversary that we celebrate today, that it's not just this, well, we'll celebrate this again in another 50 years. And the more people understand how our laws came about, the Civil Rights Act, again, which, I spend so much of my working life on, is such a prime example of really, anyone who practices civil rights laws has to know, where did this come from, and why is this certain provision in here, and how can I understand this? And that applies, in the civil rights context. It applies to so many of the other laws that I mentioned earlier, and certainly other things, where people want to go, or legislation that gets proposed to advance, as Carly said earlier, not just women's issues. I mean, these are issues for all of us, and all of us as citizens of the country. And it's just incredibly important to have that understanding.
Ms. Fiorina, you have a few final thoughts?
All you have to do is turn on the television on any random day and you will see ads for Ancestor.com or 23andMe. And we know from data that people are drawn to these sites because they want to understand their personal history. I, too, was a history major, history and philosophy, so we all love history. But the truth is, human nature, back to human nature, each of us actually want to know where we come from in order to understand who we are, which helps us figure out where we want to go. That is true of us as individuals, but it is also true of us as a community. It is true of us as a nation. And so it is important that we understand our history. It's important so that we know who we are and we know where we want to go. It's critically important for young people to understand that the rights and the freedoms that we take for granted and therefore do not always exercise, like the right to vote, were hard fought and hard won at the cost of life in many cases. And when people hear that history in a way that is, to the point, inclusive and accurate, but human and compelling, people know themselves better. people see themselves better. And I think all of us keep getting better as a result.
And wouldn't it be wonderful if everyone who gets an opportunity to visit the Turning Point Suffragist Memorial comes away with that sense of history, that their story is a part of the story of history, and that we leave with a sense of greater empowerment. So I want to thank each one of you. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to our participants in the audience. Thank you to Madam Leader, to Charnel Herring, the Majority Leader of the Virginia House of Delegates, who tried very hard to join us, and technology was not her friend this evening. But one of the biggest supporters of the Turning Point Suffragist Memorial was the late Cokie Roberts, who worked for years to enlighten viewers of ABC News and listeners of NPR. Before her passing, she was awarded the Silent Sentinel Award to recognize her devotion to women's stories. She accepted the honor through this video, which shows her passion for our project. Once again, thank you all for joining us for this commemoration, and roll the video.
It's always hard to wrap your mind around what happened to those women and to realize how brave they were. Most people in this country have no idea that women militating for the vote were imprisoned, tortured, and force-fed, all because they held up signs in front of the White House. Think of it. Women would march out of the National Woman's Party headquarters, head across Lafayette Square to bear witness to their cause, knowing that they were likely to be arrested and sent to the notorious Occoquan workhouse. You would think they were militating for something subversive, the overthrow of the government, violence in the streets, something harmful to the nation. Instead, all they wanted to overthrow was the political structure that gave them no voice and no vote, even as they paid taxes, ran businesses and farms, educated children, healed the sick, and volunteered for war work. The prison sentences grew longer and longer as the politicians in power became more embarrassed by the sight of proper ladies bearing signs with such radical questions as, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" The women had checked before their picketing campaign began to see if their actions would be legal. "Yes," came the reply. So eventually, the authorities trumped up the charge of blocking traffic on the sidewalk. And for this, women were sent off for days, and then weeks, and then months. And when their status as political prisoners was not recognized, they went on hunger strikes. The food was so laced with vermin that it was probably just as well. Then they were subjected to the painful and humiliating ordeal of force feeding. Meanwhile, sister suffragists traveled the country, lobbying politicians, organizing rallies, engaging the press, all ceaselessly working until the Congress finally passed that very simple but powerful amendment. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. That's all. That's why women went to jail, to add those 28 words to the Constitution. The story of those women remains unknown by most Americans. Their heroic deeds remain unrecognized. The Turning Point Suffragist Memorial would change that. It will finally honor those valiant women as they should be honored. Thank you for your support. It's important.